Welcome everyone to the IMRP's Theater Thursdays. I'm Andrew Clark and I direct the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at Central Connecticut State University. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a new program that we've been running. It started as Film Fridays and now Theater Thursdays, taking advantage of everybody being online during the coronavirus and trying to bring people together through showing clips of material, videos, documentaries, and the like, shorter clips, usually about 20, 25 minutes, that highlight some of the key social criminal justice issues happening today, and then bring on some fabulous panelists to have a discussion that moderated by our own Stan Simpson. So we're very excited today, and I am in particular to be showcasing the James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr. debate from February 18th, 1965. And we're joined by some really fabulous panelists, Professor Nicholas Buccola from Linfield College, Rod Ferguson from Yale University, and Karen Thorsen, who's a producer and director, in particular of James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket. So thank you so much all for joining us. And so just briefly why we picked a Baldwin Buckley debate, which might seem a little bit odd, being that it was 55 years ago. It just was really serendipitous. I am part of the Connecticut Baden-Württemberg Human Rights Research Consortium. So it's run out of UConn and a university out in Germany. And we were discussing human rights, and after the George Floyd incident, obviously, and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, conversations ensued about race, and race in particular in Germany and how it was treated, and in the U.S. And through that lens, someone brought an article from Chris LeBron, formerly of Yale, who was talking about Baldwin. And he referenced the Baldwin Buckley debate. I had never seen it or heard it. I was an English major in college and read some of Baldwin's work, but didn't know his skills as an orator. And when I watched it, I was just literally blown away. So I hope you will be as well. But so we just thought, and having conversations around Connecticut, we know Connecticut is also at this time, and has been historically for a while now, a segregated state. These conversations about race can be very different depending on where you're coming from. And I think when people see George Floyd, and especially in predominantly white and suburban rural communities, and they think, wow, this is about policing and what's the issue here, they don't really understand the full context of the history of racial segregation, of white supremacy, and the systematic way that it is infused in our society. And so I thought that this debate in particular is a great way to show that this is an ongoing conversation. But the way that this is done just really highlights some areas that I think are just fascinating. So I won't say too much more about it. It's a 20-minute clip, and then after we'll have that moderated conversation. But I did want to, because we are so delighted to have Professor Buccola with us, who wrote a book on it, the debate. And he can give us a little bit of a primer as to what we're going to see, because we're not going to see the whole thing. We're just going to start with when Baldwin steps up to the mic. So, Professor Buccola.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I'm going to give you the 5-minute setup of the debate. In the book that I wrote about the debate, there's 250 pages as the lead up to the debate. So I'll do that in 5 minutes now. February 18th, 1965. It's really, in a lot of ways, the high tide of that phase of the civil rights movement. You have Baldwin, who has been identified as is sort of the poet prophet in many ways of the Black liberation struggle. Malcolm X famously called him the poet of the civil rights revolution, a leading literary figure associated with that struggle. At that very moment, the same night of the debate, we're in the midst of the Selma campaign, for voting rights. And so it's the same night, the night of the Buckley Baldwin debate is the night that Jimmie Lee Jackson, a civil rights activist, is murdered by Alabama law enforcement. So you have these two figures at the world's oldest debating society. The Cambridge Union was 150 years old. It just celebrated its 150th anniversary a few weeks before Baldwin and Buckley are there. And you have Baldwin, this leading poet of the Civil Rights Revolution, and Buckley was sort of one of the founding fathers, the St. Paul, as one of his biographers puts it, of the conservative movement. So Buckley was a founding father of American conservatism, not as important as an intellectual, a creator of ideas, as he was important as a popularizer of ideas, as an organizer, somebody who really built a conservative movement in the decade leading up to the Buckley-Baldwin debate. And the other really important thing to know about Buckley leading into this night is that he had established himself very clearly as one of the great critics of the Civil Rights Revolution. Buckley was somebody from the beginning of his magazine he founded in 1955, National Review. His magazine was critical of the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision. They were critical of the sit-in protesters. They were critical of the Freedom Riders. They were against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They ended up being against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So Buckley was firmly opposed to the Civil Rights Revolution, and he had made it very clear that he viewed Baldwin as nothing less than a threat to Western civilization. He made that very clear in his writings leading up to this night. And so you have these two guys invited to what is predominantly a student-run debating society. So the students who hosted that debate 55 years ago, many of them are still with us. I was able to interview them for the book and try to capture their memories of it. And these guys hosted the debate. And the idea of the Cambridge Union is you'd have student debaters. So what we aren't going to see in the clips that we're about to show is two students debate prior to Buckley and Baldwin. So one student on each side. The motion before the House is the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. So one student speaks on behalf of that motion, one opposes it, and then Baldwin rises to speak. And so we can talk more about the backstory of how they got there that night, why they ended up getting invited. But I think that's kind of a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of the setup. Does that sound good, Andrew?
That's perfect. Thank you so much. We're fascinated and just so excited for the conversation after. But let's show that clip, Josh. Thank you so much.
Now we have Mr. James Baldwin, the star of the evening, who has been sitting, listening attentively, and getting a wonderful reception here in the Cambridge Union. Tremendous enthusiasm from all sides of the House for Mr. Baldwin, who has been listening to the arguments. Now will bring the voice of actual experience to the debate.
Good evening. I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. For example, I don't disagree with Mr. Burford that the inequality suffered by the American Negro population of the United States has hindered the American dream. Indeed, it has. I quarrel with some other things he has to say. The other, deeper element of a certain awkwardness I feel has to do with one's point of view. I have to put it that way. One's sense, one's system of reality. It would seem to me that the proposition before the House, when I put it that way, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro, or the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, is a question hideously loaded, and that one's response to that question, or one's reaction to that question, has to depend on an effect on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria, all have, at bottom, a system of reality which compels them to, for example, in the case of the French exile from Algeria, to defend French reasons for having ruled Algeria. The Mississippi or the Alabama sheriff, who really does believe when he's facing a Negro boy or girl that this woman, this man, this child must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. Of course, for such a person, the proposition of which we're trying to discuss here tonight does not exist. And on the other hand, I have to speak as one of the people who've been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or the European system of reality. What white people in the world, because the doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. Beneath then, whatever one's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact to destroy another. Now what happens when that happens? Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime, so that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is again not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end. Now, we're speaking about expense. I suppose there are several ways to address oneself to some attempt to define what that word means here. Let me put it this way, that from a very literal point of view, the harbors and the ports and the railroads of the country, the economy, especially of the southern states, could not conceivably be what it has become if they had not had, and do not still have indeed, and for so long, so many generations, cheap labor. I am stating very seriously, and this is not an overstatement, that I picked the cotton, and I carried it to market, and I built the railroads under someone else's whip for nothing. For nothing. The Southern oligarchy, which has until today so much power in Washington, and therefore some power in the world, was created by my labor and my sweat, and the violation of my women and the murder of my children. This, in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And no one can challenge that statement. It is a matter of historical record. In another way, this dream, and we'll get to the dream in a moment, is at the expense of the American Negro. You watch this in the Deep South in great relief, but not only in the Deep South. In the Deep South, you are dealing with a sheriff or a landlord or a landlady or the girl at the Western Union desk. And she doesn't know quite who she's dealing with, by which I mean that if you're not part of the town, and if you are a northern nigger, it shows in millions of ways. So she simply knows that it's an unknown quantity, and she wants to have nothing to do with it. So she won't talk to you. You have to wait for a while to get your telegram. Okay, we all know this. We've been through it. And by the time you get to be a man, it's very easy to deal with. But what is happening in the poor woman, the poor man's mind, is this. They've been raised to believe, and by now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible their lives may be, and their lives have been quite terrible, and no matter how far they fall, no matter what disaster overtakes them, they have one enormous knowledge and consolation, which is like a heavenly revelation. At least they are not black. Now I suggest that of all the terrible things that can happen to a human being, that is one of the worst. I suggest that what has happened to white Southerners is in some ways, after all, much worse than what has happened to Negroes there. Because Sheriff Clark in Selma, Alabama, cannot be considered, no one can be dismissed as a total monster. I'm sure he loves his wife, his children. I'm sure that, he likes to get drunk. He's, after all, one's got to assume, and he is visibly a man like me. But he doesn't know what drives him to use the club, to menace with the gun, and to use the cattle prod. Something awful must have happened to a human being to be able to put a cattle prod against a woman's breast, for example. What happens to the woman is ghastly. What happens to the man who does it is in some ways much, much worse. This is being done, after all, not 100 years ago, but in 1965, in a country which is blessed with what we call prosperity, a word we won't examine too closely, with a certain kind of social coherence, which calls itself a civilized nation and which espouses the notion of the freedom of the world. And it is perfectly true from the point of view now simply of an American Negro. Any American Negro watching this, no matter where he is, from the vantage point of Harlem, which is another terrible place, has to say to himself, in spite of what the government says we can't do anything about it. But those are white people being murdered in Mississippi work farms, being carried off to jail. Those are white children running up and down the streets. The government would find some way of doing something about it. We have a civil rights bill now. We had an amendment, the 15th Amendment, nearly 100 years ago. I hate to sound again like an Old Testament prophet, but if the amendment was not honored then, I don't have any reason for believing the civil rights bill will be honored now. And after all, one's been there since before, a lot of other people got there. If one has got to prove one's title to the land, isn't 400 years enough? 400 years, at least 3 wars. The American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there, how is it conceivably a question now? And I suggest further that in the same way, the moral life of Alabama sheriffs and poor Alabama ladies, white ladies, their moral lives have been destroyed by the plague called color, that the American sense of reality has been corrupted by it. At the risk of sounding excessive, what I always felt when I finally left the country, found myself abroad in other places, and watched Americans abroad. And these are my countrymen, and I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there is something between us. We have the same shorthand. I know, when I look at a girl or a boy from Tennessee, where they came from in Tennessee, and what that means. No Englishman knows that, no Frenchman, no one in the world knows that except another black man who comes from the same place. One watches these lonely people denying the only kin they have. We talk about integration in America as though it was some great new conundrum. The problem in America is that we've been integrated for a very long time. Put me next to any African, and you will see what I mean. And my grandmother was not a rapist. What we are not facing is the results of what we've done. What one begs the American people to do for all our sakes is simply to accept our history. I was there not only as a slave, but also as a concubine. One knows the power, after all, which can be used against another person if you've got absolute power over that person. It seemed to me when I watched Americans in Europe that what they didn't know about Europeans was what they didn't know about me. They weren't trying, for example, to be nasty to the French girl or rude to the French waiter. They didn't know they hurt their feelings. They didn't have any sense that this particular woman, this particular man, though they spoke another language and had different manners and ways, was a human being. And they walked over them with the same kind of bland ignorance, condescension, charming and cheerful, with which they'd always patted me on the head and called me shine, and were upset when I was upset. What is relevant about this is that whereas 40 years ago when I was born, the question of having to deal with what is unspoken by the subjugated, what is never said to the master, of having to deal with this reality was a very remote possibility. It was in no one's mind. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. If you walk out of Harlem, ride out of Harlem, downtown, the world agrees. What you see is much bigger, cleaner, whiter, richer, safer than where you are. They collect the garbage. People obviously can pay their life insurance. The children look happy, safe. You're not. And you go back home. And it would seem then, of course, that it's an act of God, that this is true, that you belong. where white people have put you. It is only since the Second World War that there's been a counter-image in the world. And that image not come about through any legislation on the part of any American government, but through the fact that Africa was suddenly on the stage of the world, and Africans had to be dealt with in a way they'd never been dealt with before. This gave an American Negro for the first time a sense of himself beyond a savage or a clown. It has created, and will create, a great many conundrums. One of the great things that the white world does not know, but I think I do know, is that black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically, according to human laws, unknown. Alas, that is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. What is crucial here is that unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people whom I pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. I want to say at the end, at the last, is that is what concerns me most. We are sitting in this room, and we are all, at least we like to think we are, relatively civilized, and we can talk to each other at least on certain levels, so that we could walk out of here assuming that the measure of our enlightenment, or at least our politeness, has some effect on the world. It may not. I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement, I suppose, to white people. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard, and did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which the statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday. And now he's already on his way to the presidency. We've been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president. What is dangerous here is the turning away from anything any white American says. The reason for the political hesitation and in spite of the Johnson landslide is the one that's been betrayed by American politicians for so long. And I'm a grown man, and perhaps I can be reasoned with. I certainly hope I can be. But I don't know, and neither does Martin Luther King. None of us know how to deal with those other people whom the white world has so long ignored, who don't believe anything the white world says and don't entirely believe anything I or Martin say. And one can't blame them. You watch what has happened to them in less than 20 years. It seems to me that the city of New York, for example, this is my last point, which had Negroes in it for a very long time. If the city of New York were able, as it has indeed been able, in the last 15 years to reconstruct itself, tear down buildings and raise great new ones, downtown and for money, and has done nothing whatever except build housing projects in the ghetto for the Negroes. And of course the Negroes hate it. Presently the property does indeed deteriorate because the children cannot bear it. They want to get out of the ghetto. If the American pretensions were based on more solid, a more honest assessment of life and of themselves, It would not mean for Negroes, when someone says urban renewal, that Negroes simply are going to be thrown out into the streets, which is what it does mean now. This is not an act of God. We're dealing with a society made and ruled by men. If the American Negro had not been present in America, I am convinced that the history of the American labor movement would be much more edifying than it is. It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
Tremendously moving moment now, the whole of the Union standing and applauding this magnificent speech of James Baldwin. Never seen this happen before in the Union in all the years that I have known it. Baldwin smiling, obviously delighted by his reception, tremendously moved by it.
I am now very grateful and very pleased to be able to call on Mr. William F. Buckley, Jr. to speak forth to this motion.
Now we have Mr. William Buckley, who will need all his skill to establish ascendancy over his audience, which has clearly been so deeply moved.
Thank you, Mr.
by the
President.
eloquence and
Baldwin.
personal experience of the preceding speaker.
Take our Mr. Griffith, gentlemen. It seems to me that of all the indictments Mr. Baldwin has made of America, here tonight and in his copious literature of protest, the one that is most striking involves, in effect, the refusal of the American community to treat him other than as a Negro. The American community has refused to do this. The American community, almost everywhere he goes, treats him with the kind of unction, the kind of satisfaction at posturing carefully for his flagellations of our civilization, that indeed, quite properly, commands the contempt which he so eloquently showers upon us. It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America or not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals, that our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he is treated from coast to coast in the United States with a kind of
Buckley doesn't choose to give way. The interrupter must, and he has done. The interrupter is now set down.
Goes beyond anything that was ever expected from the most servile Negro creature by a Southern family. I propose to pay him the honor this night of saying to him, Mr. Baldwin, I am going to speak to you without any reference whatever to those surrounding protections which you are used to in virtue of the fact that you are a Negro. And here we need to ask the question, what in fact shall we do about it, Mr. President? What shall we in America try to do, for instance, to eliminate those psychic humiliations which I join Mr. Baldwin in believing are the very worst aspects of this discrimination? You found it a source of considerable mirth to laugh away the statistics of my colleague, Mr. Burford. I don't think they are insignificant. They are certainly not insignificant in a world which attaches a considerable importance to material progress. It is, in fact, the case that seven-tenths of the white income of the United States is equal to the income that is made by the average Negro. I don't think this is an irrelevant statistic, ladies and gentlemen. It takes a capitalization of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per job in the United States. This is a capitalization that was not created exclusively as a result of Negro travail. My great-grandparents worked too. Presumably yours worked also. I don't know of anything that has ever been created without the expense of something. All of you who hope for a diploma here are going to do that at the expense of a considerable amount of effort. And I would thank you, please not to belie the fact that a considerable amount of effort went into the production of a system which grants a greater degree of material well-being to the American Negro than that is enjoyed by 95% of the other peoples of the human race. But even so, to the extent that your withering laughter suggested here that you found this a contemptible observation, I agree. I don't think it matters that there are 35 millionaires among the Negro community. If there were 20 million millionaires among the Negro community of the United States, I would still agree with you that we have a dastardly situation. But I'm asking you not to make politics as the crow flies, to use the fleeted phrase of Professor Oakeshott, but rather to consider what, in fact, is it that we Americans ought to do? What are your instructions that I'm to take back to the United States, my friend? I want to know what it is that we should do, and especially I want to know whether it is time, in fact, to abandon the American dream as it has been defined by Mr. Haycock and Mr. Burford. What, in fact, is it that we ought to do, for instance, to avoid two humiliations mentioned by Mr. Baldwin as being a part of his own experience during his lifetime. At the age of 12, you will find on reading his book, he trespassed outside the ghetto of Harlem and was taken by the scruff of the neck by a policeman on 42nd Street and Madison Avenue and said, "Here, you nigger, go back to where you belong." 15, 20 years later, he goes in and asks for a Scotch whiskey at the airport at Chicago and is told by the white barman that he is obviously underage and under the circumstances cannot be served. I know from your faces that you share with me the feeling of compassion and the feeling of outrage that this kind of thing should have happened. What, in fact, are we going to do to this policeman? And what, in fact, are we going to do to this barman? How are we going to avoid the kind of humiliations that are perpetually visited on members of a minority race? Obviously, the first element is concern. We've got to care that it happens. We have got to do what we can to change the warp and woof of moral thought in society in such fashion as to try to make it happen less and less. Let me urge this point to you, which I can do with authority, my friends, the only thing that I can tonight. And that is to tell you that in the United States, there is a concern for the Negro problem. Now, if you get up to me and say... if you get up to me and say, well, now, is there the kind of a concern that we, students of Cambridge, would show if the problem were our own, all I can say is I don't know. It may very well be that there has been some sort of a sunburst of moral enlightenment that has hit this community, so as to make it predictable that if you were the governors of the United States, the situation would change overnight. I'm prepared to grant this as a form of courtesy, Mr. President. But meanwhile, I am saying to you that the engines of concern in the United States are working. The presence of Mr. Baldwin here tonight is in part a reflection of that concern. You cannot go to a university in the United States, a university in the United States presumably also governed by the Lord Spiritual, as you are, in which Mr. Baldwin is not the toast of the town. You cannot go to a university of the United States in which practically all other problems of public policy are preempted by the primary policy of concern for the Negro. I challenge you to name me another civilization, anytime, anywhere in the history of the world, in which the problems of a minority, which have been showing considerable material and political advancement, is as much a subject of dramatic concern as it is in the United States. Let me just say finally, ladies and gentlemen, this. There is no instant cure for the race problem in America. And anybody who tells you that there is a charlatan and ultimately a boring man. Boring precisely because he is then speaking in the kind of abstractions that do not relate to the human experience. The trouble in America where the Negro community is concerned is a very complicated one. I urge those of you who have an actual rather than a purely ideologized interest in the problem to read the book Beyond the Melting Pot by Professor Glaser, also co-author of The Lonely Crowd, a prominent Jewish intellectual, who points to the fact that the situation in America where the Negroes are concerned is extremely complex as a result of an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. One is the dreadful efforts to perpetuate discrimination by many individual American citizens as a result of their lack of that final and ultimate concern which some people are truly trying to agitate. The other is as a result of the failure of the Negro community itself to make certain exertions which were made by other minority groups during the American experience. If you can stand a statistic not of my own making, let me give you one which Professor Glaser considers as relevant. He says, for instance, in 1900, there were 3,500 Negro doctors in America. In 1960, there were 3,900, an increase in 400. Is this because there were no opportunities, as has been suggested by Mr. Haycock and also by Mr. Baldwin implicitly? No, says Professor Glaser. There are a great many medical schools who are by no means practice discrimination, who are anxious to receive and to train Negro doctors. There are scholarships available to put them through, but in fact that particular energy, which he remarks was so noticeable in the Jewish community and to a certain and lesser extent in the Italian-Irish community, for some reason is not there. We should focus on the necessity to animate this particular energy, but he comes to the conclusion, which strikes me as plausible, that the people who can best do it, who can do it most effectively, are Negroes themselves. Let me conclude by reminding you, ladies and gentlemen, that where the Negro is concerned, the danger, as far as I can see at this moment, is that they will seek to reach out for some sort of radical solutions on the basis of which the true problem is obscured. They have done a great deal to focus on the fact of white discrimination against the Negroes. They have done a great deal to agitate a moral concern, but where, in fact, do they go now? They seem to be slipping, if you will read carefully, for instance, the words of Mr. Bayard Rustin, towards some sort of a Procrustean formulation which ends up less urging the advancement of the Negro than the regression of the white people. 14 times as many people in New York City born of Negroes are illegitimate as of whites. This is a problem. How shall we address it? By seeking out laws that encourage illegitimacy in white people? This, unfortunately, tends to be the rhetorical momentum that some of their arguments are taking.
One thing you might do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more, and for except lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight. I think actually what is wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting. Booker T. Washington said that the important thing where Negroes are concerned is not that they hold public office, but that they be prepared to hold public office. Not that they vote, but that they be prepared to vote. What are we going to do with the Negroes, having taught the Negroes in Mississippi to despise Barnett, Ross Barnett? Shall we then teach them to emulate their cousins in Harlem and adore Adam Clayton Powell, Jr.? It is much more complicated, sir, than simply the question of giving them the vote. If I were myself a constituent of the community of Mississippi at this moment, what I would do is vote to lift the standards of the vote so as to disqualify 65% of the white people who are presently voting. Not simply to give the... Now, I say then that what we need is a considerable amount of frankness that acknowledges that there are two sets of difficulties. The difficulties of the white person who acts as white people and brown people and black people do all over the world to protect their own vested interests, who have, as all of the races in the entire world have, and suffer from a kind of a racial narcissism which tends always to convert every contingency into such a way as to maximize their own power. That, yes, we must do. But we must also reach through to the Negro people and tell them that their best chances are in a mobile society. And the most mobile society in the world today, my friends, is the United States of America. The most mobile society of the United States in the world is the United States of America, and it is precisely that mobility which will give opportunities to the Negroes which they must be encouraged to take. But they must not, in the course of their ordeal, be encouraged to adopt the kind of cynicism, the kind of despair, the kind of iconoclasm that is urged upon them by Mr. Baldwin in his recent works. Because of one thing, I can tell you, I believe with absolute authority, that where the United States is concerned, if it ever becomes a confrontation between a continuation of our own sort of idealism, the private stock of which, granted, like most people in the world, we tend to lavish only every now and then on public enterprises, reserving it so often for our own irritations and pleasures. But the fundamental friend of the Negro people in the United States is the good nature and is the generosity and is the good wishes, is the decency, the fundamental decency that do lie at the reserves of the spirit of the American people. These must not be laughed at. And under no circumstances must they be laughed at, and under no circumstances must America be addressed and told that the only alternative to the status quo is to overthrow that civilization which we consider to be the faith of our fathers, the faith indeed of your fathers. This is what must animate whatever meliorism must come, because if it does finally come to a confrontation, a radical confrontation between giving up what we understand to be the best features of the American way of life, which at that level is indistinguishable so far as I can see from the European way of life, then we will fight the issue. And we will fight the issue not only in the Cambridge Union, but we will fight it as you were once recently called to do on beaches and on hills and on mountains and on landing grounds. And we will be convinced that just as you won the war against a particular threat to civilization, you were nevertheless waging a war in favor of and for the benefit of Germans, your own enemies, just as we are convinced that if it should ever come to that kind of a confrontation, our own determination to win the struggle will be a determination to wage a war not only for whites, but also for Negroes.
Tellers take their places, please. They voted in favor of the motion being that the American dream is at the expense of the Negro. They voted in favor of that motion 544 persons and against 164 persons. The motion is therefore carried by 380 votes. I declare the House to stand adjourned.
First of all, welcome back. What an interesting debate. I thought it was fascinating. For those of you who are tuned in, we have a great panel here to discuss what we see. Theme being, has the American dream come at the expense of the American Negro? We have the panelists here, including Professor Nicholas Buccola from Linfield University in Oregon. He's the author of The Fire is Upon Us, which is the backstory and chronicles the debate you saw between James Baldwin and William Buckley Jr., February 18, 1965. Professor Roderick Ferguson from Yale. His expertise in women, gender, sexual, and American studies. He's the author of several books, including the latest one being One-Dimensional Queer. We also have Karen Thorsen, who's an award-winning writer and filmmaker here in Easton, Connecticut. She's been a past collaborator with James Baldwin and was the producer and director the documentary on Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket. So folks, welcome. And my first question is this. I'll start with the gentleman who wrote the book on this debate, literally, Professor Buccola. People's mindsets. Tell us a bit about James Baldwin, how he grew up or how he came to this mindset, and a bit about William Buckley. We have two erudite guys with divergent thoughts and experiences on race, and always helps to know how they grew up. Can you illuminate a bit about how Buckley grew up and how Baldwin grew up?
Yeah, I'm happy to get us started. Maybe I'll say a little more about Buckley, since I know Rod and Karen probably can say a lot more than I can about Baldwin. So the story of Baldwin and Buckley, one of the things that drew me into this story initially was just how remarkable it was to have such dramatically different people on this international stage together at this moment in history. So Baldwin is born in Harlem in 1924. He's the oldest of 9 children. He describes what life was like growing up really powerfully, and both his nonfiction writings, Notes of the Native Son, most notably also in Down at the Cross, and then in fiction writings, especially in Go Tell on the Mountain, kind of gives a little bit of a sense of what his childhood was like in Harlem. And I think there's a couple things that are just worth highlighting, and Karen and Rod can add more detail to this. But Baldwin really describes those experiences growing up in Harlem as experiences marked by domination in many ways, as he describes so powerfully in the Cambridge speech. The sort of millions of details of every day that communicated to him that his life didn't matter quite as much. And he sees really, I think most powerfully, gives us this really vivid description of the life of his father, who was David Baldwin, who was technically a stepfather, but as Baldwin said, the only father he ever knew. And he watches this kind of domination really consume his father. His father is kind of consumed with bitterness and despair. And Baldwin, over the course of his life, I think really powerfully, and I think Karen captures this really beautifully in her film, and I know Rod's written about Go Tell on the Mountain as well. I mean, Baldwin sort of over the course of his life describes kind of coming to understand his father more and more, right, and feeling this sense of the defining fact he says about my father was that he was consumed by bitterness and despair because he had trouble feeding his children, right? And so there's I think that's a really important thing to understand about Baldwin. And also Baldwin, Baldwin's also at the margins of the margins in terms of his sexuality, which is another really important theme that we should talk about. So Baldwin is this kind of person who really, in that context, he fights back against that domination with language, right? Language is his weapon. And so the story of Baldwin's ascent to that moment with Buckley is really a story of somebody who, from a very young age, is using language, reading constantly, writing constantly, and has really tried to articulate from the inside out what the world looks like through his eyes, through the eyes of his characters, through the eyes of his subjects in his nonfiction writing. And Buckley is coming, I say he's born in the same city. A year later, he may as well have been born on a different planet, right? Buckley is born to immense privilege. He spends most of his childhood at a 47-acre estate in Sharon, Connecticut, known as Great Elm. He has every possible, and Baldwin describes his childhood as being marked by claustrophobia and a seemingly, all this limiting of his opportunities and freedom. Buckley describes his childhood as seemingly limitless space, right, and limitless opportunity. Live in, servants, live in tutors. He's taught everything under the sun, including a particular worldview, which really emphasizes kind of hierarchy, and he's taught that a racial hierarchy is part of what his parents raised him to believe in. And so Buckley really takes that worldview first, to a prep school. Eventually, he goes to Yale, and ends up writing his first book, which is this indictment of his. The kind of indoctrination he thought students were receiving at Yale, right? That they were sent there by their Christian individualist parents only to be converted to atheistic socialists. So Buckley really, he's also, the thing he has in common with Baldwin is he is somebody devoted to the use of language, but he uses his language in a very different way, right? He uses his voice and his pen, first at Yale as a debater and as an editor of the Yale Daily News, and then eventually as an author, as somebody who was constantly on the road giving lectures, as somebody who edited his own magazine, had a thrice weekly newspaper column. That he uses that all of his weapons available to him rhetorically to defend a particular worldview, which is really is about as radically different from Baldwin's as imaginable. So that's kind of a general introduction to both of them.
So you had a guy who was an elitist versus a guy who all he knew was oppression throughout his life. Both highly educated, but their worldview shaped by elitism and sheer oppression, right? Karen Thorsen, you worked with Baldwin and were very involved with your documentaries, and we'll bring in Professor Ferguson in a second. What was Baldwin like? To kind of person was he?
To answer your question, contrary to what I would call a really, truly willful misreading of James Baldwin, what was he like as a person? He wasn't out to overthrow Western civilization. He was so full of love and light and laughter. He was eloquent. Yes, he had words were his weapon and his tool, eloquence, but he put it to wonderful use, and it was not destructive use. It was more of a plea. I think they saw things as a threat, and Baldwin made a plea for we can be better than we are. And he wasn't without hope. He was full of anger, but he wasn't without hope.
How did the two view each other, Buckley and Baldwin, with disdain or sort of a respect? That they were both highly educated. I'm curious to how they viewed each other.
Well, we just saw in the video You see Baldwin's eyebrows go up. He can't quite believe what he's hearing. I think he was respectful and polite, but he was, I mean, this is a lifetime experience. He was constantly subjected to opinions that were, frankly, outrageous.
Yeah.
And hurtful.
Professor Ferguson, you saw the reaction of this crowd in England, a standing ovation for Mr. Baldwin, which is sort of not a call for a debate. They try to have you temper your enthusiasm versus sort of polite applause for Mr. Buckley. Professor Ferguson, what did you take of the reaction of these white kids in England in 1965 to this, to what Mr. Baldwin was saying?
Well, I mean, Baldwin was the only one who did the assignment. The motion was, is the American dream destructive to the American Negro? Baldwin was the only one that did the assignment. He talked about, it's interesting to think about his sort of rhetorical strategies. He begins by talking about how the thing that we call race, the racial system, is not something that is exclusive to the US. He says to that audience, it began in Europe. So it's part of a kind of global dilemma of which the audience is a part. And then he talks about how that thing called race destroys the sense of reality of the oppressed persons or the oppressed communities, in this case, Black people, right? And then he talks about kind of social crisis that it produces, for the system itself, right? So in many ways, setting up the context for understanding the civil rights movement, what will later become the Black Power movement. He's the one who did the assignment, Instead, Buckley uses it to attack Baldwin as a writer, in really condescending, in really, racist ways. At one point, he says to Baldwin, if we're going to take him seriously, we have to address him as a white person and, forget about any ways in which his Blackness has any merit, in the debate setting. He also then astonishingly ends by talking about the generosity of the Brits to their former enemies during World War II, the Germans, and then analogizes that to the generosity that white Americans will have towards Black people. So he's already constructing Black folks as the foreigners within the US when Black people are citizens. And so he's also someone who knows how to strike a moral chord with his words, so he's not simply giving an intellectual argument that is devoid of any sort of ethical sensitivity. He manages to combine them both. He begins by saying, I come to you as a kind of Jeremiah, the one who delivers a critique, but also delivers the prophecy. Buckley can't do that. And the crowd responds.
So why did this crowd respond that way? Because again, these were, for the most part, white students in England, law students in 1965. Buckley was making the case for white supremacy and making the case, as you said, there's a tiered structure. The Negro has its place. And so why did that fall apparently on deaf ears? I said it's sort of inappropriate to give a standing ovation during a debate, highly inappropriate, which told you the level of persuasiveness, at least with Baldwin's argument. I'm wondering, what about those kids, that audience at that time, why were they more receptive to a Baldwin narrative than to a Buckley narrative than to a Baldwin narrative?
Well, I'll yield to, Karen and Nick in this, but, to begin with, we have to understand the context. This is the moment of anti-colonial revolution, right? Baldwin refers to it. This is the moment in which you have former colonized nations coming into independence as a result of anti-colonial struggle. Baldwin acknowledges those struggles. He says that they were an inspiration to American Blacks in the civil rights movement. And so it's not as if those struggles are only meaningful to Black people around the world. They're also reshaping those white kids in that audience.
Professor Buccola and Ms. Thorsen, I had you piggyback on that. Why you would think this audience, based on the time frame and culture, would be more receptive to a Baldwin narrative? They were not. Can you add to that? Why do you think they seem to be enlightened and I would say pleased by what Baldwin was saying, but certainly enlightened by it?
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, so this is something that it was really interesting to talk to, these students and kind of get their sense, 50 years on, of why the room played the way it did that night. I mean, one thing you don't pick up in the clips we showed that is referred to a couple of times is that the student debater on Buckley's side, who was this guy Jeremy Burford, who was a very skilled debater, he went on to sort of win these international championships in debate. He was laughed at by the room. So I mean, it really gave Baldwin and Buckley a sense of the room prior to them getting up. And I think that union, that particular union, was quite conservative. It's interesting. I mean, it was obviously it's this elite university, and these are elite students, so they have a kind of natural conservatism, one might say. But that union itself had just prior to the Baldwin Buckley debate, they had several votes that were very much right leaning. They had a vote in support of a conservative government in the UK that was about to get thrown out of office by the public. They had a vote against revolution in South Africa. They had a vote that was kind of a little bit sympathetic to one of the leading kind of white supremacist politicians in the UK, this guy Peter Griffiths. So it was an interesting thing. So Buckley, so one thing I can say about it, there's a lot one could say about why the room reacts the way it does to Baldwin. There was this kind of international headlines, right? That at the very moment when Baldwin and Buckley are debating, in newspapers around the world, you're seeing images of Sheriff Jim Clark using his cattle prod, right, which Baldwin refers to in his speech, against men, women, and children in Alabama who are fighting for their right to vote. So there was a kind of sense in which, the sort of tide was turning, right? And even if those students, maybe even a year prior, had been more sympathetic to Buckley's point of view, there was a kind of sense in which they knew they were on the wrong side of history. And I mean, one thing Buckley says, within the next 50 years, right, that Buckley lives after the debate, he's trying to explain what happened that night, right? From 2 weeks out, he writes his syndicated column about it. And basically in his syndicated column 2 weeks out, he says, first thing he says, he misremembers within 2 weeks of the event. He says, Baldwin got a standing ovation before he uttered a single word, before Baldwin uttered a single word. That's not true. We have the videotape, right? But Buckley believed that was true. And he said it again and again for the next 50 years. And it was a planned orgy of anti-Americanism.
It's funny you mentioned it, because I was going to ask you about the Buckley ego. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you, and Karen, you can chime in here too, the Buckley ego, growing up as he did, elite, aristocratic, this highly educated elite guy, speaking to his base. This was, as you mentioned, these were conservative white kids in England. This is the Buckley base. It must have been enormously wounding to his ego to see them support this black guy who's intellectually beating them from their standpoint. So how much did that bruise his ego? And Karen, you can chime into whether Baldwin ever commented on that situation and how Buckley, the Buckley ego, did he ever concede that, okay, I lost this debate, or how did he feel about it? The reaction.
First, I have to say I can't help drawing parallels to our current, shall we call it, regime in America, and the question of ego and denial of actual fact. But I'd like to go back to the really interesting question of why the crowd reacted in the Cambridge Union as they did, given their somewhat elitist personal
conservative
positions. And I believe it's because, well, Baldwin is eloquent, but he didn't just take care to, he, from the core of his being, spoke to their humanity, spoke about his own humanity, spoke about the common ground that they shared, and then he put it on, as has been said just during our discussion now, he put it in moral terms, that what Jim Clark, that sheriff down south who was poking women and children with a cattle prod, was doing was horrific externally, but he said it's even more horrific what must be going on inside of that sheriff in order for him to be able to treat other human beings that way. What delusions is he operating under? And when James Baldwin talks about the moral question that's being raised by the treatment of the American Negro, as it's called in the 1965, he's talking about not just a Black problem, but a problem for all of humanity. It's something we have to deal with, and here we are 55 years later still having to deal with it. It is not just a Black problem. It is a problem for Black, for white, for all human beings.
Can I add something to that, Stan?
Sure, please do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. You know, I also want to say that that rhetorical strategy that Baldwin uses, you know, to sort of say that the problem of race is not simply the problem of the subjugated. It is also the problem of the subjugator. You know, that is something that has a very long history. Frederick Douglass says it in his autobiography. Aimé Césaire says it in The Discourse of Colonialism. Toni Morrison will go on to say it. Audre Lorde will also go on to say it. So we see Baldwin really enacting and deploying a certain thread of rhetoric that has a long history to it, to sort of make the problem of race also the problem of what it does to the racist.
And I couldn't agree more. And just to underscore that, the fact that Baldwin is as eloquent as he is, remember that he was a boy preacher. He was not just a writer, he was a speaker, and he always managed to win over a crowd with that kind of depth and skill. He was a prophet. His parallel to Jeremiah is not untoward.
Now, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, if I could just add to the course of agreement here, you know, I think that this, I mean, I agree with everything Karen and Rod have just said. I mean, this is, you know, Baldwin right from the get-go, right, makes this announcement. I'm here as a kind of Jeremiah, right? He's there to deliver this sermon as a kind of Jeremiah figure on white supremacy and the ways in which white supremacy destroys, as others have said, right, the subjugated and the subjugators, and describing what that looks like. And so that's really, I think, really a central theme, and it really gets to the core of what Baldwin does in all of his writing and all of his speaking. I mean, he's really trying to draw us back, you know, to this question of identity, to this question of who is it that we take ourselves to be, and how does that construction of identity lead us to treat other people, right? And that has something to do with our dignity and the dignity of other people. And I think that's kind of the unifying theme for me, at least in reading Baldwin's fiction, nonfiction, this kind of core of his life is what does freedom and fulfillment look like for a human being, and what is it that we're doing to ourselves to inhibit our freedom and fulfillment?
And, you know, two interesting themes that you see there. Baldwin makes the case that, you know, racism is systemic, institutionalized, and there has the price to pay, the legacy of it. Yeah, Baldwin said Buckley is saying basically it's isolated. You know, that yes, racism is there, but there also has been Black achievement, and that Black folks articulate the racism, but don't talk about the incremental growth. To a large degree, those two arguments are still very much alive today. People who feel, hey, there's a legacy here of slavery that, you know, impacts everyday society, and white privilege is still very much alive and well. And those who say, hey, that was a long time ago. Look at, we elected Barack Obama. How can we still be a racist country? Professor Ferguson, you guys can all chime in on that. Let's talk about why those two arguments still resonates very loudly today.
Well, you know, I'm so happy you pointed this out, Stan, that one of the differences that we see between Baldwin's speech, Buckley's speech, is that Baldwin has a structural analysis. You know, Baldwin indicts the system, you know. Buckley, on the other hand, says, what do we do about that policeman?
Yeah.
What do we do about that barman? So he's already making the problem of race into an individual one that has to do with changing people's hearts, making them more concerned. You know, he reduces the problem to, you know, just a very individual level, whereas Baldwin insists, no, this is historical, it is structural. That has to be the mode of address.
It's the parallel between George Floyd and so many others and our current protests that are still going on.
Yeah. So why do you think that still resonates 55 years later? Because it seems like history is the great elixir. To understand history, can make the connection, understand the context, you would think that changes minds. And maybe that happened with that crowd that gave a standing ovation. They were educated to, okay, they're getting it. But it doesn't seem like that history and the context has resonated with enough people. Certainly a lot of people are much more quote unquote woke, but you still have folks who are pretty much in denial about history, a la the Confederate flags and the monuments, or who know about it and just say, well, I don't care, this is how I was growing up and this is what I believe in. So why are we still here, despite growing acknowledgement of what slavery has emanated over the years?
I think part of it is a lack of understanding of that history. I think a majority of people, and that goes right to the polarities existing in education. And the lack of acknowledgement of our own past makes it hard for us to understand where we came from. Baldwin said more than once the phrase that we saw in The Fire Next Time, know whence you came. Yeah. If you do understand what we came from, the Cambridge debate was talking about where did we come from and what was this country built on.
Yeah. How about with education? Go back, and you guys saw Professor Ferguson and Buccola and Karen, as well as you, Ms. Thorsen. How do we change the education? Because what's happening, a lot of these teachers don't know the history either. That's very clear. Some of these teachers who are in public schools have never been taught the context of history, so therefore they're perpetuating this sort of white racist philosophy, and so they don't know what they don't know. So how do you systemically change what kids are being taught in public schools if the teachers aren't taught the context of this? We can jump in. Professor Buccola, you can start first, and all you can chime in.
Yeah, I mean, just to build off what Karen and Rod have said. I mean, I think that this Buckley toward the end of the speech, and I think some of it was captured in the clip that we heard. He says that this whole thing can be explained by way of an unfortunate conjunction. And he uses the phrase, the conjunction is, on the one side, individual racists are out there, and we need to convince them to not be so racist. Now, one of the things, it's interesting that, of course, he's emphasizing the individual, as Rod said. He's also removing himself from the category of racism, right? He's been opposing all these things for the last decade, but now he's saying racism is something that is this particular thing. It's this kind of animus toward people who are different from you. And of course, we now know, we should know, and we need to teach people to know that racism is a much more capacious thing, and it operates in a lot of different ways. And then he says, but Buckley says the other side of the conjunction is, he says, failures of the Negro community, right? So now he goes from the individual to the community, and we see this happening all the time in our politics. This is this thing of blaming, right? Of blaming cultural factors and so on. And what Mike Baldwin helps us understand this so well, right? What is going on there? And why are we stuck in this cycle? Well, we're storytelling animals, and the stories that we like, the stories that we cling to, are ones that make us feel safe, right? And so what that kind of storytelling that Buckley's doing there, what it does is it removes us, right? We are no longer complicit in this destruction, right? And I think that's what Baldwin allows us to see. And Baldwin, to go back to what you were pointing out, Stan, all these different sort of moments of triumph in the civil rights struggle, right? The sort of court decisions and legislation and elections and so on. I mean, this is a moment when Baldwin, one could say, should be feeling triumphant, right?
Right.
But Baldwin is always there to say, I want to think about these questions, these big questions. Of course, politics matter. Of course, the courts matter, and so on. But he always wants us to look at the world through the eyes of those at the margins, right? How has the world really changed for folks at the margins of the society? So he's always there, again, as that prophetic figure to call on us to do more. Yes, but there's so much more work to be done. And that's where I think Baldwin is such a powerful voice, because he's never going to let you off the hook.
Yeah. And I want to encourage, before I continue on, I want to encourage everyone tuned in to join the conversation through the chat. Feel free to ask your questions, and we'll get them in. We want to encourage you all to ask any questions as you hear the conversation. So one thing I thought was interesting with this is that Baldwin makes the case that, hey, I'm reminded I'm Black in every walk of life, from the taxi cab driver to the police person to the landlord. I'm reminded that I'm Black, and in their minds, inferior in every walk of life. And he makes this profound statement that I want to be seen not as a ward of America, but someone whose ancestors built this country. I thought that was very powerful. Can you guys talk about, Karen, you work hand in hand with them. That was a very powerful, I thought, one of the elements of his oratory, that issue of being treated as a ward, someone to be patronized rather than somebody whose ancestors built this economy.
The irony of the debate is that just he says this, he speaks before Buckley and says, I'm not a charity case. And yet Buckley treats him like one. Oh, what can we do to help the poor, lowly Negro who, through faults of his own, has somehow, suffered the worst parts of society? Well, that, of course, isn't really the case.
Mm-hmm. Professor Ferguson?
Yeah, I'd say that, every racist discourse, every colonial discourse, constructs the subjugated person, the subjugated community, non-white people, non-Western folks as children, okay, in need of tutelage and development. I think this is cut out of this clip, but Buckley also says that in order for the Black folks to vote, they have to be sophisticated enough to vote.
Yes.
They're not quite ready yet,
Yes.
for that benefit of democracy. If you go back to the early parts of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt said something similar about the Filipinos after the U.S. had acquired the Philippines. So, you can also see that discourse in the way that the British are talking about folks in India during British colonialism and British occupation of that. So every racist discourse, every colonial discourse has to construct the folks that it subjugates as children in need of development. Things will come gradually. You have to prove to us,
Right.
that you're ready for this. And we see that repeated, as Karen was just saying. Baldwin understands that that is part of racist discourse. He says, I am not your ward. And then what does Buckley do? He becomes the racist.
Well, I thought was very interesting from Buckley's standpoint. He said, what Black folks really want, folks, is power. He said, take all this racism, okay, what they want is power. And you're saying, Professor, but he's saying, but he's basically saying, I don't think they're ready to acquire this power, right? You want to simplify what he's saying, that it comes down to power, and that Black folks need to be ready if they want to acquire this power. It's not something we just give them. That's kind of what I heard from it. Any thoughts on that? You all can chime in on that.
I would remind people to think that Buckley posed that as a threat, that Black people want power, whereas I think that what James Baldwin was actually voicing was that we want the power to become better than we are, not just better off than we are, but better than we are. And the fact that he said we're human beings, we're also murderers and dictators.
Yes.
He wasn't trying to say we're the saints, you're the sinners. He was saying we all are terribly complex human beings, but we all are very much alike, and the common ground that we share is humanity. So that's where the power is.
Yeah, and you may disagree. I would say the power may also speak to wealth, the ability to build prosperity. Political power is important. We also know this tremendous Black-white wealth gap is 2% for Black people, has been for 50 years. And to a large degree, folks have argued that when you equalize the power or the wealth, the prosperity, that things then get better. A la South Africa and apartheid, where even when Mandela took over, whites still control the country through their power and their affluence and what they own. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would throw in here that related to a number of these great comments is that, Baldwin, I mean, one of the things that's cut out of not only the clips that we saw, but also the BBC recording, the entirety of the debate of the Baldwin and Buckley speeches, they had to be edited down to fit within an hour for the BBC recording. So fortunately, one of these students that's still living had an old reel-to-reel copy in his attic, and he sent it to me from England. So we have the full audio is included in the audiobook and transcribed in the book. And one of the questions that comes up, right, a lot of the things that are cut out are questions that students asked of Buckley. And a lot of the questions that Buckley got were questions that all of us have that we want to ask Buckley as we're listening to that speech. And I mean, just to pick up on a theme that's been discussed here is that one of the students says, can you point to me anywhere in Mr. Baldwin's writings, Mr. Buckley, in which Baldwin calls for the overthrow of Western civilization? And so one of the comments that Karen made earlier, and one of the things that Buckley says, he goes back to that line that we've been quoting, right? Buckley says, well, he makes a quip, right, to make the audience laugh, which he was very good at doing to define the situation. And then he says, well, I think that I didn't know I should have been forbidden to read Mr. Baldwin's writings prior to arriving here tonight. And if you do read Mr. Baldwin's writings, which clearly you haven't, you would find that he says the one thing that white people have that black people should want is power. And for Buckley, this is the core of it and gets at what Rod was just talking about. Buckley really wanted Baldwin to say that the thing that white people have that black people should want is civilization, right? Buckley said that explicitly in his writings, his most infamous editorial, Why the South Must Prevail. He says the white people are entitled to rule because they are, for the time being, the advanced race. He says that's a quote. And so Baldwin, is there to say, hang on a second, right? And not only just to say, hang on a second, in all these different ways to really complicate that story. But he says, just one last point on this, Baldwin, when he's asked about the debate later on, he says that the one thing about Buckley I can tell you is he refuses to listen. He refuses to listen. So that idea is, as Karen and Rod have said, that if Buckley had been listening to Baldwin right there in that moment, and he would not have said what he said, and but he clearly that was not what he was there to do. He was there to do something else, perform in a very different way.
I want to stay with you, Professor Buccola. The most fascinating thing you found, you wrote the book, The Fires Upon Us, which gave the backstory and chronicle this debate. With your research, what was the most fascinating nugget or two that you found with the backstory on it? Something that really you said, wow, this is interesting.
Man, that's a tough question. And I would say that one of the most fascinating things to think about was although a lot of people come to the book, I think maybe with a desire to connect again with Baldwin, right, in a different way. And I've had a number of people tell me I wanted to skip the Buckley parts. But one of the things that ends up being, I think, valuable about the Buckley side of the story, as I'm weaving these stories together, is that you really get to think in slow motion. You get to watch Buckley adapt, to this changing political situation around him. And through this one portrait, right, you're able to really, I think, get a better, it's sort of as a reminder of how we've seen politics evolve over time in response to liberation movements. So I think that's one really powerful kind of overall theme. But I think another really, I didn't go into the book thinking I would reach this conclusion, but one of the really telling things is as I weave these stories together and tell the story of the debate, you of course have the end of the debate, you have this resounding victory for Baldwin, but one of the themes of the book are the ways in which Baldwin won that battle but lost the war, right? I mean, Buckley, in many ways, his politics are ascendant in decades after the debate. And I think that's one of the things that's most important about this story, is really thinking about the ways in which Buckley tapped into a new kind of politics of racial resentment. And he really was instrumental in promoting that politics of racial resentment over the next few decades. So I think that's a really important, kind of theme that is emphasized in the book. And, it's just a reminder of why I think Baldwin does matter so much, because he helps us see really the moral emptiness of that ascendancy.
And so relevant to today's politics. I mean, it's on full cycle right around it. Ms. Thorsen, you worked hand in hand in a documentary on James Baldwin. What was the most fascinating thing that you pulled out? Something that you can share with us that you thought was just extraordinary about your experience, what you learned?
Well, one detail, I'm sure that Nick can speak to this even better than I, but one detail that I learned about the Cambridge Union debate is how the students voted. They actually had to visibly, instead of casting a ballot that you hide and you don't show how you're voting, they had two doors, Gothic stone archways in the Cambridge Union. And the tradition was that those who voted yes in favor of James Baldwin's premise would go through one door, and the ones who voted no in favor of Buckley went through the other door. So it was a very visible vote. And so I think that's interesting, given their elitism and their background and their presence in Western civilization, the fact that they had to do so not just vocally, but physically.
Yeah, it was visual and also visceral, because again, you could see how they're going to vote based on the level of intensity of their applause. That thought was extraordinary. Professor Ferguson, you're an expert on women's, gender, sexual American studies. Baldwin is known now, struggled a bit with his sexuality, the black male back in that day. Can you speak to that? He was a black intellectual, civil rights advocate who struggled with oppression, but also apparently his sexuality. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I would characterize it as Baldwin struggling with his sexuality. I would characterize it as many of the folks around Baldwin struggling with his sexuality. So, like, for instance, folks in the Black Power movement struggled with just the fact of a Black gay man as the prophet, as Malcolm X said, of the Civil Rights Revolution, right? And, you know, Baldwin had really, really interesting things to say about, you know, sexuality, its relationship to race. You know, that was one of the reasons why I was, you know, really interested as a young scholar in his novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, but also, you know, some of the things that he was saying about in the Cold War period about how the homosexual was constructed as the threat and the foreigner, you know, to American democracy, and also how the American Black, American Negro constructed as the foreigner and the threat. In fact, we just heard it from Buckley, you know, who basically says that as the Germans were to the British, the Blacks are to white Americans. And I think that in this moment, what's really interesting, if you think about the Black Lives Matter movement, is that that part of Baldwin that was suppressed in many of the discourses around civil rights, Baldwin, the queer man, is exactly what many folks in the Black Lives Matter movement at this moment are trying to revive. You know, it's Baldwin's take on sexuality, its relationship to politics, its relationship to race, but also doing that alongside folks like Audre Lorde, the Black lesbian feminist poet, Angela Davis, and other folks. So there's a way in which what's different about this moment and the sort of address to race and racism than in the moment that occasioned the Buckley and Baldwin debate is that there's an explicit engagement with queerness, with transness, and in that way, people are exercising the part of Baldwin that didn't get exercised in the civil rights movement.
So it's no longer an impediment from your thoughts. It's no longer as much as it was.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's the thing. Like you hear, if you go to Black Lives Matter marches, you know, it's not unusual to hear things like, you know, say her name, you know, as part of march, or Black trans lives matter, or Black queer lives matter. So what used to be a taboo, and not to say that it's completely gone away, homophobia, misogyny exists still, but the way in which it's put forth as an explicit part of Black Lives Matter is completely unprecedented. And also, I will say that, you know, 2 of the 3 authors of the hashtag Black Lives Matter are Black queer women.
Interesting. Final question, I think, is looking at the issue with the Confederate flags and the monuments and tearing down statues. You know, for those who are against tearing down statues, you hear some of the same sort of narrative that Buckley was perpetuating. And for those who want to see them torn down, you hear a lot of things that were echoed by Mr. Baldwin. Can you all talk about that, how that narrative is still, again, to me, very striking when it comes to celebrating our past and the Confederate past and people who maybe had some moral issues, but seemingly made some contributions to the country?
It's so important that we educate ourselves about not just tear it down, but perhaps examine who they were and what they did, and then acknowledge that. I would think that would be better than trying to erase it.
Yes. Professor Buccola, the monument issue.
Yeah, this is, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this, and you know, because one of Baldwin's central themes, right, is this demand that we come to terms with our history, right? And he thinks that's so essential to our sort of individual identities and to our collective identities, right? This question of who we take ourselves to be. And so in that context, I think that, trying to apply that central injunction to this monument debate gets complicated. But I mean, one thing Baldwin really wants us to confront our history and in all of its ugliness, right? And that we cannot try to avoid coming to terms with that history. I think that the thing that's very obvious from a Baldwinian perspective, from my interpretation is that, of course, part of coming to terms with your history is absolutely setting aside or obliterating our mythologies that we've constructed that are fundamentally false forms of identity that we essentially constructed in order to make ourselves feel superior to others. So there's this kind of Confederate exceptionalism, this kind of lost cause mythology that Baldwin would absolutely be calling on us to subject that to serious interrogation and to ask folks why they need that, right? Why do they need that to have a sense of value in the world, and what are they missing? What ways are they not liberated by clinging to this kind of Confederate history? But yeah, I think that Baldwin wants us. So he wants us to come to terms. He doesn't want us to avoid. He wants us to come to terms with the most, difficult parts of our history, and that's, he thinks, essential, to our liberation. So I think that would be a kind of central, Baldwinian lesson on that front.
Yeah, piggybacking that, go ahead, Ms. Thorsen.
Well, just that was exactly what you said, Nick. That was the goal of what was going to be James Baldwin's next book. Unfortunately, he died at the young age of 63. But Remember This House was going to be his revisitation of the civil rights movement, of our history, of all of the details that led us to where we are now. And then the question of not just what progress has been made, but how much is still to be made. And how much time do you want for your progress, which is a famous quote of his.
We'll go to the chat room.
I would only add that, this is also the broad vision of systemic transformation and change that Baldwin had in mind, that the system is not simply the political system, the economic system, but it's also the educational system. To both Karen and Nick's point, Baldwin in the address says what we are not facing is the result of what we've done. So he's calling for a historical reckoning, like that would actually be a reckoning that would transform all the systems, that make up race within the U.S.
To go on that point, we have a question here in the chat room, and I'll paraphrase it. Have any of the panelists thought about having this debate in their classroom and teaching your class about that? If so, how do you do it? That's for the two professors. Obviously, Ms. Thorsen, you have a documentary that you produced. Could that be used again as a teachable moment in the classrooms? To what degree are we engaging this debate and the work you've done in getting it into these classrooms? How do you do that? And are you doing that?
I think all of us are trying to put these ideas out there in the classroom, and I do it personally. We founded the James Baldwin Project back in 2015 when we had our film was originally shot on 16 millimeter film, then it got to video, and we had it restored with the help of Martin Scorsese and the Thorn Foundation. Once it was a restored digital film, we started taking it around to have community discussions. And we did this in the state of Connecticut and then the state of Massachusetts. And then it became a national thing. We're even doing it in other countries. It is a tool. There are many tools. We're also working on a digital curriculum where people can actually download portions of Baldwin lesson plans and design their own teaching plan. But I'm not a professor. I happen to have the privilege of working with professors. I wouldn't have even known Baldwin if it weren't for professors like Rod and Nick, because I was assigned to read Baldwin when I was in college.
Yeah. Professors?
That changed my life.
The professors Buccola and Ferguson, you thought about embedding this debate into your curriculum, and if so, how would you do it? And if have you tried it yet?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a couple of things that I take Baldwin's lead here. I mean, Baldwin, there's a couple lines that come to mind in thinking about these questions, these big historical questions for us as a society, and also the question of how we teach history. And those two lines are, history is present in everything we do, is one thing Baldwin says, right? So that way in which he goes into the first person in the speech, right? I built the railroads and so on. Yeah. And he wants us to really think about legacy, right? Where past meets present. And that's absolutely crucial to him. And the other thing about that is that, and I think this is we're seeing a lot of this trope of in the right-wing media right now about, well, they just want us to feel guilty. They want us to feel guilty. And one of the lines I love from Baldwin is, this is not about guilt, right? And this is something he says to Buckley in a later exchange they have. This is not about guilt, right? This is about responsibility. I know you didn't do it. I didn't do it either, but we're human. So we have a responsibility to do something about it. And so I think for students, as they examine this history, I think that's, reconstructing this history, role-playing this debate, however you want to do it, really examining what's going on here. They might at first glance see themselves, as very different from the roles that Baldwin and Buckley are playing, or see that as a sort of bygone era. But I think as educators, one of the things we want them to do, as active learners, is to figure out the ways in which that story, here we are 55 years later, and many of the things that Baldwin is saying could be said yesterday, right? And many of the things that Buckley is saying are still being said. So we need, and that, so clearly then the question becomes, what do we do about it? And there again, there's all sorts of wonderful directions to go from there. And really the students themselves are the ones that have to answer that question. They're the ones that I think Baldwin would tell us, they're the ones who are going to answer it with much more wisdom than a lot of us can, right? Because they have a sense of what needs to happen next.
Yeah, wisdom and action. Professor Ferguson, I think, did we hit you? I don't recall. Did you have a chance to weigh in? Because we have about 2 minutes left. Did you want to?
Sure. I'll just be really quick. I always try to teach Baldwin, frankly, with Black women and Black queer and Black trans folks. So
why?
Talking about
Why?
Why? Because as powerful as Baldwin is, as the prophet of the Civil Rights Revolution, as a public intellectual, there's a danger in presuming that this debate is owned by men. Okay? And this is 65. 4 years after that, Third World Women's Alliance will emerge from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They will take Baldwin's critique of race as a national issue and as a global issue and apply it to gender inequality. After that, in 1970, the mid-70s, the Combahee River Collective of Black lesbian feminist socialists will come about, and they will also take that critique and apply it to the critiques of economic inequality and also homophobia. In the 1980s, Black queer men will revive Baldwin as a kind of gay foreparent and use him as inspiration to produce their own narratives about the varieties of Black masculinity that also admit and acknowledge the central place of sexuality.
You all were phenomenal.
I always try to teach Baldwin as part of a chorus, so that we get a full picture of what's going on with race in the U.S.
Fascinating conversation. You all were phenomenal. I want to thank again Professor Nicholas Buccola, Professor Roderick Ferguson, and Karen Thorsen. I want to thank you all who all tuned in. Andrew Clark, the director of IMRP, will close us out. Andrew, talk to you.
Thank you, Stan. It certainly did not disappoint, and I really, again, appreciate everybody for participating. I will say one of the things that's so amazing about this time and age that we live in is this ability to find knowledge just by virtually having a question, and you can research these things. And it's essentially how I came across Professor Buccola and Ms. Thorsen, who I just met yesterday via a phone call, and along with Rod Ferguson, who John Lucas, who works with us at the Institute, put us in touch with, generously gave their time today. So I do want to definitely thank them for that. As someone who in our institute, we struggle with these issues, and we have been for the past 15 years. I wanted to jump in so much, but I will take the liberty of asking one question that was in the chat room here. Is that, are we at a tipping point? If in that debate, Baldwin said, if the 15 Amendment was not honored then, how am I to believe the Civil Rights Bill will be honored now? What would he think about the situation we are in now? Would he think it's a tipping point, or would he see that he would have to have the same speech today?
I believe Baldwin was never without hope, but I want to offer a single anecdote piece of hope that just last night I had the privilege of listening in on a panel discussion that was led by high school students from our town of Easton Reading, Weston. It's a Region 9 group, actually, Easton and Reading. And they have, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, stepped forward to try and analyze what's going on in their own high school and circulated a petition asking for changes in the curriculum and staffing and administration. And they led this discussion, which had professors and school administrators and teachers and our state representative, Ann Hughes, all of them answering questions that were brought by the students. Now, they did this on their own. To me, that was extraordinary. Whether it's a tipping point, whether the town will respond, that's another question. But the fact that the students, that's where James Baldwin put his hope. He believed that young people were the tipping point.
Here, here.
He was a teacher too, by the way. He was a professor.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Professor Buccola?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Karen just said, and similar things are happening, in the town where I teach, a small town, and students are taking that sort of initiative, and I think that that's exactly right. I mean, Baldwin, as Karen said in her first comments as part of our panel, he was somebody who didn't believe he had the right to give up hope, right? I mean, he said that at various points in his life, although his hope had been undermined at every turn in many ways, he said, as long as I'm breathing, I have to have hope. I have to continue to fight. And also, I think that, going back to something Rod said, about teaching Baldwin recognized, and you can look at his dialogues with Audre Lorde and Nikki Giovanni to kind of really show the way he recognized, sitting with Nikki Giovanni in 1971, and he in many ways, he says he's acknowledging the ways in which his vision, as capacious as it was, is limited in some ways, and that he is calling on, in many ways, calling on that next generation to pick up where he's leaving off. And so I think that really is, Baldwin has this kind of radically democratic figure. He's really telling us that the millions of details of every day, each of us has some part to play in changing those details of every day to make sure that the freedom and dignity of all human beings is respected. And so that's, I think, the radical hope that Baldwin gives us.
Right. Professor Ferguson?
Yeah, I would say, I agree with everything that Karen and Nick have said. Also, I would not frame it in terms of a tipping point, because tipping point too often suggests an anxiety about social transformation. If you think about Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, one of the things that he says to the ministers in that city who say things like, "Why are you agitating?" And he says, that you're not responding. We have to bring it to a point where there is an eruption. That's what these protests are about. And so look, from that view, we should not be anxious about a necessary social transformation. The question is, how will we become part of the necessary social transformation?
Right. Well, thank you all again so very much. And I want to say what we were hoping with this Theater Thursday, and a lot that we're going to be doing during the Black Lives Matter, is to whet people's appetite on a particular topic, a particular individual, and hopefully that will springboard them into further discussion and discourse about this and interest. And so we will send along to everybody reading materials from all of the three panelists, as well as the movies. There's I'm Not Your Negro is streaming on about Baldwin on Netflix and I believe Amazon Prime, along with many others. And so there's plenty out there if you want to learn more. And in terms of professors, if they're interested in bringing this into their classroom, certainly get in touch with us, and we'd love to do that. So, thank you all again, and have a good evening. And,
thank you, guys. Great job.
Thank you. It's an honor to be part of this. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.